The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of what I thought was still my home, casting familiar shadows across the worn linoleum floor that had witnessed 37 years of my life. I stood there in my pink terry cloth robe, the one with the small tear near the left pocket that I kept meaning to mend, holding a steaming cup of coffee in my trembling hands. The ceramic mug felt cold despite the heat radiating from within, and I realized my fingers had gone numb sometime during the sleepless night that had just passed. The phone call from my attorney, Margaret Chan, still echoed in my ears like a nightmare that refuses to fade with daylight. Her voice had been gentle but firm, the kind of tone reserved for delivering devastating news to elderly clients. She had explained the legal documents, the signatures, the dates, the official seals, all while my world crumbled around me like old wallpaper peeling from water-damaged walls. My son Michael had done the unthinkable. The house creaked above me as footsteps moved across the hardwood floors of what had been my bedroom for nearly 4 decades. Those were not my footsteps. They belonged to my son and his wife Jennifer, who had moved in 3 months ago under the pretense of helping me manage my finances and household affairs. The irony was so bitter I could taste it on my tongue, metallic and harsh like old pennies. I had trusted him completely. The coffee in my hands had grown lukewarm as memories washed over me in waves. I remembered the day Michael was born, how his tiny fingers had wrapped around mine with such surprising strength. I recalled teaching him to ride his bicycle in the very driveway where his black BMW sedan now sat, the one he purchased after getting his promotion at the insurance company. The same promotion that had required him to move back to our hometown, the same promotion that had brought him back into my life just when I needed family the most. Or so I had thought. The sound of the shower turning on upstairs made my stomach lurch. The water pressure in this old house was never quite right, and I knew exactly how long it would take for the hot water to travel through the pipes to the master bathroom. 7 minutes and 30 seconds. I had counted those seconds thousands of times over the years, first when my late husband Robert used to shower before his shift at the automotive plant, then later during the lonely years after his heart attack when I would count anything to fill the silence. Now someone else was using my shower, sleeping in my bed, making plans for my future without my consent. The legal papers spread across my kitchen table told a story that seemed impossible, yet the official letterhead from the county clerk's office made it undeniably real. According to these documents, I had signed over power of attorney to Michael 6 weeks ago, granting him complete control over my assets, my finances, and my property. The signature looked convincing enough to fool government officials and bank representatives, but I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed those papers. I would have remembered signing away my life. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above the stove, its red digital numbers glowing like angry eyes. 9:37 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, and my entire existence had been reduced to a stack of fraudulent paperwork and a growing sense of betrayal that felt like ice water in my veins. My hand shook as I reached for the cordless phone on the counter. The plastic felt slippery against my palm, damp with perspiration despite the cool autumn air that had settled over our small Midwestern town. I needed to call my daughter Sarah in Phoenix, needed to hear a familiar voice that would remind me that not all of my children had turned against me. But as I lifted the phone to dial, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, measured footsteps that belonged to my son. My heart began to pound so hard I was certain he would hear it from across the room. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he descended, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation I was not prepared to have. Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his navy blue pajamas, the expensive silk ones that Jennifer had bought him for Christmas last year. His dark hair was still damp from the shower, and he moved with the casual confidence of someone who belonged in this space. Someone who owned this space. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice carrying the same warm tone he had used as a child when he wanted something special for breakfast. "You're up early." I stared at him, searching his familiar features for some sign of the deception that had been living in our house for months. His eyes were the same shade of green as his father's, and for a moment, I saw Robert looking back at me. The resemblance was so strong it made my chest ache with longing for the man who would have protected me from this nightmare. "I know what you did," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Michael's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture. A subtle tension that crept into his shoulders, a slight tightening around his eyes that spoke of guilt barely contained. He walked to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup, the liquid splashing against the ceramic with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen.
"What are you talking about, Mom?"
The casualness of his tone was like a slap across my face. I held up the legal documents with hands that trembled so violently the papers rustled like autumn leaves. "These papers, Michael. The power of attorney.
I never signed these."
He took a long sip of his coffee, steam rising from the cup to cloud his glasses. When he looked at me again, his expression was patient but condescending, the look a parent gives to a confused child who has misunderstood something simple.
"Mom, we talked about this. You signed those papers in Attorney Wilson's office.
Jennifer and I were both there as witnesses.
You said you wanted me to help you manage your affairs because keeping track of everything was getting too overwhelming."
The words hit me like physical blows.
I had never met Attorney Wilson.
I had never been to his office. I had never expressed any desire to hand over control of my life to anyone, not even my own son. Yet Michael spoke with such conviction, such apparent sincerity, that for a brief moment I wondered if my memory was failing me more severely than I had realized.
But no. Some things are too important to forget, and signing away your home is one of them.
"I would remember signing these papers," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word.
"I would remember going to a lawyer's office.
I would remember making such an important decision."
Michael set his coffee cup down on the counter with more force than necessary.
The sharp clink of ceramic against granite seemed to echo through the kitchen like a warning shot.
His patient expression began to crack, revealing something harder underneath. "Mom, you've been forgetting a lot of things lately. Last month you called me in a panic because you thought someone had stolen your car, remember? It was in the garage the whole time.
And you've been having trouble with the checkbook, mixing up numbers, forgetting to record transactions." Each example he cited felt like evidence in a case I was losing without understanding how. It was true that I had been more forgetful recently, more anxious about managing the details of daily life that had once come so naturally. Since Robert's death 3 years ago, the responsibilities of homeownership and financial management had felt increasingly burdensome. I had made mistakes, forgotten appointments, misplaced important documents.
But I would not have forgotten signing over my house.
"Those are small things," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady.
"Everyday confusion that everyone experiences as they get older. That doesn't mean I would forget something as significant as giving you power of attorney."
Jennifer's voice floated down from upstairs, calling Michael's name with the casual familiarity of someone who had every right to be in this house. The sound made my skin crawl. She had been nothing but polite and helpful since moving in, offering to cook dinner, to help with grocery shopping, to organize my medications. I had been grateful for her presence, thankful that my son had married someone who cared about family responsibilities. Now I wondered if every kindness had been calculated, every helpful gesture part of a larger plan to convince me of my own incompetence. Michael glanced toward the ceiling at the sound of his wife's voice, then back at me with an expression that had grown noticeably cooler. "Mom, I think you should talk to Dr. Martinez about these memory concerns.
Maybe it's time to consider whether living alone is really the safest option for you anymore."
The suggestion felt like ice water in my veins. Dr. Martinez had been my physician for 15 years, ever since Dr. Hoffman had retired. She was thorough and compassionate, but she was also young enough to be influenced by concerned family members who painted pictures of elderly confusion and declining capacity. "There's nothing wrong with my memory," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I felt a flicker of doubt.
Had there been signs I had missed? Moments when my thinking had been cloudier than I realized?
"Of course not," Michael said, but his tone suggested otherwise.
"But getting a professional opinion would put everyone's mind at ease. Including yours."
The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls were closing in around me. The familiar space where I had prepared thousands of meals, where I had helped my children with homework, where I had shared quiet morning coffees with my husband, now felt foreign and threatening. The yellow walls that I had painted myself 20 years ago seemed faded and shabby. The kitchen table where family discussions had once been warm and supportive now felt like the site of an interrogation. Michael finished his coffee and placed the empty cup in the dishwasher with the careful precision of someone who belonged in this kitchen. The gesture was so natural, so proprietary, that it made my throat close with emotion. "I have to get ready for work," he said, his voice returning to its earlier warmth.
"Why don't you think about what I said? About talking to Dr. Martinez? It really would be the best thing for everyone."
He kissed my forehead before leaving the kitchen, the same gentle kiss he had given me as a child when saying goodbye before school. The familiarity of the gesture was heartbreaking. This was still my son, the baby I had nursed through countless childhood illnesses, the teenager I had supported through his awkward years, the young man I had been so proud to see graduate from college and build a successful career. Yet he had betrayed me in a way I never could have imagined. After he left, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the legal documents spread before me like evidence of a crime I could not prove had been committed. The signature on the power of attorney papers was indeed similar to my own, but something about it felt wrong. The loops of the letters were too perfect, too controlled. My arthritis had been affecting my handwriting for several years, making my signature less steady, less precise than it had been in my younger days. This signature looked like it had been written by someone without arthritis. I reached for my purse and pulled out my checkbook, flipping through recent entries to compare signatures. The difference was subtle but noticeable. My recent signature showed the slight tremor and irregular pressure that came from joints that no longer moved with their former fluidity. The signature on the power of attorney was smooth and confident, lacking the small imperfections that had become characteristic of my handwriting. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was there. The house grew quiet as Michael and Jennifer prepared for their respective days. I heard the shower running again, heard drawers opening and closing, heard the murmur of conversation between them. They moved through the morning routine with the comfortable efficiency of a married couple in their own home. Which, according to the legal papers, this now was. I called my attorney, Margaret Chen, and asked her to meet me for coffee at the small cafe downtown, away from the house where I could no longer be certain of privacy. Margaret had been Robert's lawyer first, helping us with our wills and estate planning, and she had continued to handle my legal affairs after his death. She was a woman of about 50 with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for fighting hard for her clients. When I arrived at the cafe, I found Margaret already seated at a corner table, her briefcase open beside her chair and several documents spread across the small surface. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, creating an atmosphere of normalcy that felt at odds with the crisis consuming my life.
"Helen," Margaret said, rising to embrace me with genuine warmth. "I'm so glad you called. We need to discuss your options."
I slid into the chair across from her, grateful for the solid wood beneath me and the familiar sounds of ordinary life happening around us. An elderly man at the next table was reading a newspaper, occasionally commenting on the headlines to his companion.
A mother with 2 young children was trying to negotiate the terms of a hot chocolate purchase. The mundane interactions felt precious in their normalcy. "Is there anything we can do?"
I asked, wrapping my hands around the warm coffee cup Margaret had ordered for me.
"Can we prove that I didn't sign those papers?"
Margaret's expression was compassionate but not encouraging.
"It's going to be very difficult, Helen.
The documents appear to be properly notarized and witnessed. Michael and Jennifer both signed affidavits stating they were present when you executed the power of attorney.
From a legal standpoint, the paperwork looks legitimate."
The words settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable.
"But I know I didn't sign them. I know I never went to any lawyer's office. I know I never made the decision to hand over control of my finances and property."
"I believe you," Margaret said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "But believing you and proving it in court are two different things. We would need evidence of forgery, and that's extremely difficult to establish, especially when the forgery is well executed." I thought about the subtle differences I had noticed between the signature on the power of attorney and my recent signatures in my checkbook.
What about handwriting analysis? Couldn't an expert determine that I didn't sign those papers?
Possibly, but it's expensive and not always conclusive, especially with elderly clients who may have experienced changes in their handwriting due to age, medication, or health conditions.
A skilled attorney could argue that any differences are simply the result of normal aging or temporary physical issues.
The hopelessness of my situation began to sink in like cold water.
Even if I could prove that someone else had signed my name to those documents, How could I prove that it was Michael? How could I prove that the son I had raised and loved and trusted had deliberately and methodically stolen my home and my independence? What happens now? I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. Margaret consulted her notes, flipping through several pages of legal terminology that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Michael now has complete control over your assets. He can make decisions about your living arrangements, your healthcare, your finances. Legally, he is acting as your agent with full authority to manage your affairs as he sees fit. Even if I object? Even if you object. The power of attorney grants him the authority to act on your behalf even if you disagree with his decisions. The legal presumption is that you made an informed choice to grant him this authority when you signed the documents. The cafe suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too filled with the sounds of other people living their normal lives while mine fell apart around me. I excused myself and walked outside into the cool October air, gulping deep breaths that tasted of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Margaret followed me onto the sidewalk, her expression full of the kind of sympathy that comes from witnessing too many family tragedies in her legal practice. Helen, there is one option we haven't discussed. If we could prove that Michael is not acting in your best interests, if we could demonstrate that he's using his power of attorney for his own benefit rather than yours, we might be able to challenge his authority. A spark of hope flickered in my chest. How would we do that? We would need to document any actions he takes that benefit him financially rather than you. Any decisions that seem motivated by his interests rather than your welfare. Any evidence that he's using his authority to enrich himself at your expense. I thought about Michael and Jennifer living in my house, sleeping in my bed, using my utilities, eating food purchased with my money. But providing care for an elderly parent and living in the family home to offer support could easily be justified as being in my best interests. It won't be easy, Margaret continued, but it's not impossible. The key would be finding evidence of deliberate financial exploitation or showing a pattern of decisions that clearly benefit him rather than you. We agreed that Margaret would begin researching the possibility of challenging the power of attorney on grounds of abuse or fraud, while I would document everything I could about Michael's actions and decisions since moving into my house. It felt like a small step forward, but at least it was movement in some direction other than complete surrender. When I returned home, the house felt different. Perhaps it was simply my heightened awareness of the legal reality, but every familiar object seemed to have lost some of its connection to me. The furniture I had carefully selected over decades of marriage, the photographs covering every surface, the small decorative items that marked important moments in my family's life, all of it felt somehow provisional, as if I were a guest in someone else's home. Michael was already gone for the day, but Jennifer was in the living room with her laptop open on the coffee table, working from what had been Robert's favorite chair. She looked up when I entered and smiled with the bright warmth she had shown me since the day Michael first brought her home to meet me. "Good morning, Helen. I hope you had a nice time out. Michael mentioned you went to meet with your attorney." The casualness with which she mentioned my meeting sent a chill down my spine. Had Michael told her where I was going, or had she known for some other reason? I found myself wondering how long they had been planning this betrayal, whether Jennifer had been part of the scheme from the beginning or if Michael had drawn her into it later. "Yes, we discussed some legal matters," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Oh, good. Michael and I have been so worried about you managing everything on your own. It's such a relief that you're getting professional help with the complicated stuff." Her tone was so sincere, so filled with apparent concern, that I felt a moment of doubt about my suspicions. This was the woman who had been bringing me cups of tea in the evenings, who had helped me organize my medication schedule, who had insisted on driving me to doctor's appointments when Michael was at work. How could someone who seemed so genuinely caring be part of a plot to defraud me? But then I remembered the legal documents, the forged signature, the systematic way my independence had been stripped away while I was made to feel grateful for the help. "Jennifer," I said, settling onto the couch across from her, "can you tell me about the day I signed the power of attorney papers? Michael says you were there as a witness, but I'm having trouble remembering the details." Her fingers paused on the keyboard, just for a moment, but long enough for me to notice. When she looked up, her expression was patient and slightly concerned, the look one gives to someone who might be having memory problems. "Of course, Helen.
It was about 6 weeks ago, on a Wednesday afternoon. You had been worried about managing all the financial paperwork, especially the insurance forms and tax documents. Michael suggested that giving him power of attorney would simplify things for you, and you agreed that it was a good idea. She spoke with confidence and specificity, providing details that should have helped clarify my memory but instead felt hollow and rehearsed. I had no recollection of any Wednesday afternoon trip to a lawyer's office, no memory of discussing my concerns about financial paperwork, no awareness of ever expressing a desire to hand over control of my affairs.
Which law office did we visit?
I asked, hoping to catch her in an inconsistency.
Attorney Wilson's office, downtown on Maple Street. The one in the old brick building next to the flower shop.
You commented on how much you liked the flowers in the window display. The detail about the flowers was particularly unsettling because it was exactly the kind of small observation I would make and remember. Jennifer knew me well enough to craft a believable story using my own habits and preferences. Yet I had absolutely no memory of admiring flowers in any window display while walking to a lawyer's office I had never visited.
Was I feeling well that day?
I asked, grasping for any explanation that might make sense of my complete lack of memory about such an important event. You seemed a little tired, but that's not unusual.
You'd been having some trouble sleeping, remember?
You mentioned that you'd been lying awake at night worrying about bills and paperwork and whether you were handling everything correctly. Again, she was right about the details. I had been having trouble sleeping, and I had been worried about managing household finances on my own. But I had never discussed these concerns with Michael and Jennifer, had never asked for their help with anything more complicated than reaching items on high shelves or lifting heavy objects.
I think I'll call Attorney Wilson's office, I said, watching Jennifer's face carefully.
I'd like to get a copy of my file, just for my own records. That's a great idea, Jennifer said without hesitation. I think having all your important documents organized and easily accessible will give you peace of mind. Her ready agreement surprised me.
If she and Michael were involved in some kind of fraud, wouldn't she try to discourage me from contacting the lawyer who had supposedly witnessed my signature?
Unless, of course, Attorney Wilson was also part of the scheme, or unless they were confident that their deception was thorough enough to withstand scrutiny. I spent the rest of the morning in my bedroom, using the phone extension to make a series of calls that gradually painted a picture of just how comprehensive Michael's betrayal had been. Attorney Wilson's office confirmed that I had indeed visited on the date in question and that all the paperwork appeared to be in order. When I asked to speak with Attorney Wilson directly, I was told he was in court but would return my call later that afternoon. My bank representative, a cheerful young man named David who had been handling my accounts for several years, confirmed that Michael was now authorized to make transactions on my behalf and had already begun using that authority. He had transferred several $1,000s from my savings account to checking, ostensibly to ensure I had adequate funds available for monthly expenses. He had also inquired about the possibility of consolidating my accounts to simplify management. "Your son is very thorough," David said admiringly.
"He's asked for detailed statements going back 5 years and has been asking excellent questions about optimizing your account structure."
You're lucky to have such a financially responsible family member looking out for your interests. Each conversation added another layer to the web of legitimacy that surrounded Michael's actions. Everyone I spoke with had been impressed by his knowledge, his concern for my welfare, his systematic approach to managing my affairs. From the outside, it looked exactly like a devoted son helping his aging mother navigate the complexities of financial management. But I knew the truth was darker and more calculated than anyone realized. Attorney Wilson returned my call at 3:15 that afternoon, just as I was beginning to wonder if he would contact me at all. His voice was deep and reassuring, with the kind of professional warmth that comes from decades of helping clients through difficult decisions.
"Mrs. Patterson, I understand you have some questions about the power of attorney documents we executed last month. I'm happy to help clarify anything that might be confusing. Mr. Wilson, I appreciate you calling me back. I was hoping you could help me understand exactly what happened during my visit to your office. I'm having some difficulty remembering the details." There was a brief pause before he responded, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for some sign that would confirm or deny my worst suspicions. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson.
Memory can be selective, especially when we're dealing with stressful decisions. You came to my office with your son Michael and his wife Jennifer on Wednesday, October 2nd. You expressed concerns about managing your financial affairs and wanted to grant your son power of attorney to help simplify things for you.
The date meant nothing to me. October 2nd might as well have been any other day, completely unremarkable and utterly absent from my memory.
But Attorney Wilson spoke with the same confidence and specificity that Jennifer had shown, providing details that should have been meaningful but felt completely foreign.
Can you tell me what I was wearing that day?
I asked, testing whether his memories were as detailed as they seemed. I'm afraid I don't recall your specific attire, Mrs. Patterson. I see many clients each week, and while I remember the legal proceedings clearly, I don't typically retain such personal details. His inability to remember what I was wearing was actually reassuring in its honesty. Someone creating a false memory might have provided too many details, might have tried too hard to make their story convincing.
Attorney Wilson's response felt genuine, which made my situation even more disturbing.
If a respected attorney believed I had been in his office, if he had witnessed my signature and believed it to be authentic, then either I was experiencing severe memory loss or the deception was far more sophisticated than I had imagined.
Mr. Wilson, would it be possible for me to see my file?
I'd like to review the documents I signed and perhaps refresh my memory about our conversation.
Certainly. You can stop by my office anytime during business hours.
I'll make sure my secretary has your file readily available. After ending the call, I sat in the quiet of my bedroom, staring out the window at the oak tree in my backyard that Robert had planted the year Michael was born. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and I found myself wondering if I would be here to see them fall to the ground. If Michael had his way, I might be living in some kind of assisted care facility by winter, watching other people's trees change seasons.
The thought motivated me to action.
I needed to document everything I could about my current situation before Michael made any more decisions about my future. I found an old notebook in my desk drawer and began writing down every detail I could remember about the past 3 months, every conversation, every change in routine, every moment when I had felt confused or unsupported. Writing helped clarify my thoughts and revealed patterns I had not noticed before. Michael and Jennifer's arrival in my home had coincided with a series of small incidents that had made me question my own competence. The missing car keys that turned up in unusual places. The forgotten appointments that I was certain I had written down correctly. The bills that seemed to arrive later than expected, causing late fees and penalties that made me feel irresponsible and scattered. At the time, these incidents had seemed like unfortunate signs of aging, evidence that I was struggling to manage the details of daily life. Now I wondered if they had been deliberately orchestrated to make me doubt my own capabilities and welcome help from my son. I was still writing when I heard Michael's car in the driveway. The BMW's engine had a distinctive sound that I had learned to recognize over the past 3 months. I quickly hid my notebook in the back of my desk drawer and tried to compose myself for another evening of pretending that everything was normal. Michael entered through the front door calling my name, his voice carrying the cheerful tone of someone arriving home to his own house.
Mom! I'm home.
Something smells fantastic in here. The smell was coming from the slow cooker, where I had prepared a pot roast with vegetables, the same recipe I had been making for my family for 30 years. Cooking dinner had become one of the few ways I still felt useful in my own home, though I wondered how much longer I would be allowed even that small responsibility. Dinner will be ready in about an hour, I called back, walking into the living room where Michael was loosening his tie and settling into Robert's chair with the casual familiarity of ownership.
Perfect timing.
I had a crazy day at work, and nothing sounds better than coming home to one of your home-cooked meals. The word home struck me like a physical blow. This was his home now, legally and practically, while I had become something like a tolerated guest in the house I had shared with my husband for decades. Jennifer emerged from the kitchen carrying 3 glasses of iced tea on a tray, playing the role of gracious hostess in my own dining room. She had changed out of her work clothes into casual jeans and a soft sweater, and she moved through the space with the comfortable confidence of someone who belonged there. "How was your day, Helen?" she asked, settling onto the couch with her tea.
"Did you have a chance to rest after your meeting this morning?"
The question felt loaded with meaning, though her tone was casually interested. I wondered what she and Michael had discussed about my visit with Margaret Chen, whether they were concerned about what legal advice I might have received.
I had a quiet afternoon, I said carefully.
I spoke with Attorney Wilson about getting copies of my documents. Michael looked up from his phone, where he had been scrolling through emails.
That's great, Mom. It's always good to have your own copies of important paperwork. Did he mention anything else about your case?
My case? The phrase struck me as odd.
I wasn't aware I had a case.
Poor choice of words, Michael said with a sheepish smile.
I meant your file, your legal documents.
It's just lawyer speak from spending too much time around the legal department at work. But his slip felt significant.
Why would he think of my situation as a case unless there was some kind of legal strategy involved? Unless he and Jennifer were planning something that required careful legal maneuvering?
Dinner passed with the kind of pleasant conversation that had become routine since Michael and Jennifer moved in.
We discussed Michael's current project at work, a complex insurance claim that was requiring extensive investigation.
Jennifer talked about her freelance graphic design business and a logo project she was particularly excited about. I shared news about Mrs. Henderson next door, who had recently returned from visiting her grandchildren in Colorado. On the surface, we looked like a normal family sharing a meal and catching up on the day's events. But underneath the pleasant facade, I felt the constant tension of living with people who were not what they seemed to be. Every smile felt calculated, every expression of concern felt hollow, every gesture of affection felt like manipulation. After dinner, Michael insisted on cleaning the kitchen while Jennifer and I sat in the living room watching the evening news. The normalcy of the routine was almost comforting, except for the underlying knowledge that nothing about my life was normal anymore. Helen, Jennifer said during a commercial break, Michael and I have been talking about some improvements we could make to the house to help you live more comfortably. Simple things like grab bars in the bathrooms and better lighting in the hallways.
What do you think?
The suggestion was reasonable and thoughtful, exactly the kind of modification that would benefit someone my age. But I also knew that any improvements they made to the house would increase its value and ultimately benefit them rather than me. That sounds helpful, I said, because refusing would seem unreasonable and might raise suspicions about why I was being uncooperative.
Wonderful.
We were also thinking about updating some of the older appliances. The washing machine has been making that strange noise, and the refrigerator seems to be working harder than it should. It would be more energy efficient to replace them now rather than waiting until they break down completely.
Again, the logic was sound. Both appliances were indeed showing their age and would need replacement eventually.
But I also knew that updating major appliances would further establish Michael and Jennifer's investment in the house and make it harder for me to argue that they were not acting in my best interests. Whatever you think is best, I said, feeling like I was signing away another piece of my independence with each agreement. Michael emerged from the kitchen with a satisfied smile, having restored order to my domain with the efficiency of someone who had every right to reorganize my cabinets.
All clean, he announced.
Mom, I was thinking we should sit down together tomorrow evening and go over your monthly expenses. I want to make sure we're not missing anything important and that your budget is optimized for your current needs. The prospect of having my son audit my spending habits felt deeply invasive, but I knew that refusing would only support his narrative about my inability to manage my own affairs. I was trapped in a situation where cooperation looked like competence and resistance looked like confusion. That would be helpful, I said, though the words felt like sandpaper in my throat. That night, I lay in what had been the guest bedroom for 37 years, listening to the sounds of Michael and Jennifer settling into my master bedroom. I could hear their muffled conversation through the thin walls, could hear Jennifer's laugh at something Michael had said, could hear the familiar creak of the old bed frame that Robert and I had bought during the early years of our marriage. The ceiling above me was marked with water stains from a roof leak we had repaired 5 years ago, irregular brown patches that looked like continents on an ancient map. Robert and I had often joked about those stains, making up stories about the countries they resembled and the adventures we might have there. Now they just reminded me of problems I could no longer solve, repairs I could no longer oversee, decisions I was no longer allowed to make. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by anxiety and the constant awareness that I was no longer safe in my own home. Every sound seemed potentially significant. Every creak of the house settling might be Michael or Jennifer moving around, making plans, searching through my belongings, consolidating their control over my life. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and moved quietly to the kitchen, hoping that a cup of tea might calm my nerves enough to allow a few hours of rest before dawn. The house was dark and silent, with only the soft glow of the digital clocks casting small pools of light in the darkness. I was waiting for the water to boil when I heard voices coming from upstairs. Not loud enough to make out specific words, but intense enough to suggest some kind of disagreement or serious discussion. Michael's voice carried the authoritative tone he used when he was trying to convince someone of something important. Jennifer's responses were quieter, more cautious, with the rhythm of someone asking questions or expressing concerns. The conversation lasted for about 10 minutes, then faded into silence. I never heard footsteps or doors closing, but gradually the house returned to its usual nighttime quiet. I made my tea and sat at the kitchen table, wondering what they might have been discussing at 3 in the morning, what plans might require such urgent, secretive coordination. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather for October, the kind of Indian summer day that feels like a gift before winter settles in for good. I decided to spend time in my garden, partly because the physical activity and fresh air would help clear my mind, and partly because I wanted to document the current state of my property while it was still legally mine. My garden had been Robert's pride and joy, a carefully planned landscape of perennials and annuals that provided color from early spring through late fall. After his death, I had struggled to maintain it at the level he would have expected, but I had managed to keep the basic structure intact and the major plants healthy. Now, as I walked among the flower beds with my camera, I realized that this might be one of the last times I would have the authority to make decisions about which plants to keep, which to remove, how to prepare the garden for winter. If Michael and Jennifer decided that maintaining the landscaping was too much work for someone my age, they could have everything removed and replaced with low-maintenance alternatives. I spent the morning taking photographs and making notes about the current condition of each section of the garden. The roses needed pruning, the hostas were ready to be divided, and several areas could benefit from additional mulch before the first frost. Under normal circumstances, these would be tasks I could handle myself or hire someone to complete according to my preferences. But my circumstances were no longer normal. Jennifer found me around 11 o'clock, carrying a glass of lemonade and wearing the kind of concerned expression that had become familiar over the past few weeks. "Helen, you've been out here for hours. I was getting worried that you might be overdoing it." The suggestion that a few hours of light garden work might be too much for me was another small erosion of my perceived competence. 6 months ago, I had spent entire days working in my garden without anyone questioning whether the activity was appropriate for someone my age. "I'm just enjoying the nice weather," I said, accepting the lemonade gratefully. "It won't be long before it's too cold to spend time outdoors. I know you love your garden, but Michael and I have been concerned about you doing heavy lifting and using sharp tools without anyone around to help. What if you fell or cut yourself? We might not even know you were hurt until it was too late." Her concern was not unreasonable. Gardening did involve some physical risks, especially for someone in their 70s. But I had been gardening safely for decades, knew my limitations, and took appropriate precautions when working alone. More importantly, I recognized that her comment was laying the groundwork for future restrictions on my activities, another way to establish that I needed constant supervision and could not be trusted to make my own decisions about risk and safety. "I'm very careful," I assured her. "And I stay close to the house so I can call for help if I need it." "Of course you are. You're very responsible. But accidents can happen so quickly, even to people who are usually careful. Michael and I would feel so much better if you could save the heavy garden work for when we're home to help." The conversation continued in this gentle, reasonable tone that made every restriction seem like a caring suggestion rather than a limitation on my freedom. By the time Jennifer returned to the house, I had agreed to avoid using the heavier garden tools, to limit my outdoor work to short periods, and to focus on lighter activities like watering and deadheading flowers. I had just voluntarily given up another piece of my independence. That afternoon, Margaret Chen called with an update on her research into challenging the power of attorney. Her tone was professional but not encouraging, and I found myself bracing for disappointment before she even began explaining what she had discovered. "Helen, I've been reviewing similar cases and consulting with colleagues who specialize in elder law.
The challenge we're facing is that Michael appears to be acting within his legal authority and making decisions that could reasonably be viewed as being in your best interests. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, not wanting to miss any nuance in her explanation. What do you mean?
Well, he's living in your home, which could be justified as providing care and supervision. He's managing your finances conservatively, not making any obviously self-serving investments or expenditures. He's encouraging you to seek medical evaluation, which shows concern for your health and welfare. On paper, everything he's doing looks like responsible family caregiving. But he forged my signature to get the power of attorney in the first place. That's what we believe, but proving it would require handwriting analysis, and even then, the results might not be conclusive enough to overturn properly notarized legal documents. Plus, Michael and Jennifer both signed witness statements confirming that you executed the documents voluntarily. I sank onto my bed, feeling the weight of hopelessness settling over me like a heavy blanket.
So there's nothing we can do? I didn't say that. But we need to be strategic and patient.
What we need is evidence that Michael is using his power of attorney for his own benefit rather than yours, or proof that he's making decisions that are clearly not in your best interests.
How long could that take?
It's hard to say. Weeks, months, maybe longer. The key is documenting everything and waiting for Michael to make a mistake that reveals his true intentions. After hanging up, I sat in my bedroom staring out at the street where I had lived for nearly 4 decades. Children from the neighborhood were riding bicycles on the sidewalk, their laughter drifting through my window like an echo from happier times. Mrs. Henderson was working in her front flower bed, and Mr. Crawford was washing his car in his driveway. Everything looked normal and peaceful, a picture of suburban life continuing its predictable rhythms while my world crumbled in private. Margaret had advised patience, but I was 73 years old and living in a house that was no longer mine with people who had betrayed my trust in ways I was still struggling to understand.
How much time did I have to wait for Michael to make a mistake? How many more small freedoms would I lose while gathering evidence that might never be sufficient to restore my independence?
I heard Michael's car in the driveway and quickly composed myself for another evening of careful performance. Tonight was the night he had scheduled to review my monthly expenses, the night when he would officially take control of my financial life while making it seem like he was simply helping me organize my affairs. When he entered the house, Michael was carrying a briefcase and wearing the confident expression of someone prepared for an important business meeting. He kissed my forehead in greeting and headed straight for the kitchen table, where he began spreading out papers and files with the systematic precision of a professional presentation.
"I've organized everything by category," he explained as I joined him at the table.
Monthly fixed expenses like utilities and insurance, variable expenses like groceries and gas, discretionary spending like gifts and donations, and annual expenses like property taxes and home maintenance. The level of detail was impressive and slightly overwhelming. Michael had clearly spent considerable time analyzing my financial habits and creating a comprehensive picture of how I spent my money. Each category was supported by bank statements, receipts, and calculations that demonstrated both his thoroughness and his complete access to my financial records. "As you can see," he continued, pointing to a summary sheet covered with numbers and calculations, "your current spending exceeds your monthly income by about $400. You've been making up the difference by withdrawing from savings, which is fine in the short term, but it's not sustainable long term." The math was correct, though I had not realized the shortfall was quite so significant. Since Robert's death, I had been less careful about tracking expenses, partly because the emotional burden of managing finances alone had made me avoid dealing with details that reminded me of my changed circumstances. "What do you suggest?" I asked, though I suspected he already had a complete plan prepared.
"Several options.
We could reduce some of your discretionary spending, particularly in areas that might not be essential anymore. For example, you're still paying for cable television packages and magazine subscriptions that you might not need.
We could also look at ways to reduce your housing costs."
"Reduce housing costs?" Michael pulled out another sheet of paper covered with real estate information and cost comparisons.
"I've been researching some very nice senior living communities in the area.
Places where you wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance, yard work, or household repairs. Your monthly expenses would be more predictable, and you'd have built-in social activities and medical support." The conversation had shifted from budget analysis to housing recommendations so smoothly that I almost missed the significance of what was happening.
This was not really about optimizing my finances.
This was about convincing me to voluntarily leave my home and move into some kind of assisted living facility.
I'm not ready to leave my house, I said, trying to keep my voice steady and reasonable. Of course not. This is just preliminary research, exploring all the available options. But it's important to think about the future and make sure you have a plan that will work as your needs change.
Jennifer appeared in the kitchen carrying a tray with coffee and cookies, as if this were a pleasant family discussion rather than a systematic dismantling of my independence. She set the tray on the counter and joined us at the table, reviewing Michael's financial analysis with the interested attention of someone who had every right to be involved in planning my future. "These senior communities look wonderful," she said, studying the brochures Michael had collected.
"Look at all the activities they offer.
Art classes, book clubs, exercise programs, social events.
It might actually be more fun than living alone in this big house."
The way she emphasized alone made my isolation sound pathological rather than simply the natural result of widowhood. And describing my house as big suggested that it was somehow inappropriate for someone my age, too much space and responsibility for an elderly person to manage.
"I've lived in this house for 37 years, I said. "All my memories are here. Robert and I raised our family here. This is my home. And it's a wonderful home," Michael said gently.
"But maintaining a house this size is a lot of work, and it's only going to get more difficult as you get older.
We want to make sure you have options available when you're ready to consider them."
The conversation continued for another hour, with Michael presenting various scenarios and alternatives while Jennifer provided supportive commentary that made their suggestions seem reasonable and caring. By the time we finished, I had agreed to visit several senior living facilities, just to see what was available, just to be informed about my options. I had not agreed to move anywhere, but I had agreed to take the first steps in that direction. That night, I lay in the guest bedroom listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling for the night, aware that each sound might soon belong to someone else's experience rather than mine. The heating system cycling on and off, the old wood floors creaking as the temperature changed, the wind moving through the oak tree outside my bedroom window, all the small sounds that had provided comfort and continuity through decades of change and loss. If Michael had his way, I would soon be listening to different sounds in a different room, surrounded by strangers instead of memories, dependent on institutional schedules instead of personal choice. The prospect was terrifying in a way that had nothing to do with the practical concerns of aging and everything to do with the loss of identity that comes with losing your place in the world. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because I woke to bright sunlight streaming through the guest room curtains and the smell of bacon cooking downstairs. The clock on the nightstand showed 9:30, much later than my usual waking time, and I felt disoriented and slightly panicked by the disruption to my routine. When I made it downstairs, I found Michael and Jennifer at the kitchen table eating breakfast and reviewing what appeared to be real estate documents. They looked up when I entered, both smiling with the cheerful energy of people who had been awake and productive for hours.
"Good morning, sleepyhead," Jennifer said warmly. "I was just about to bring you breakfast in bed. You were sleeping so soundly, we didn't want to wake you." The concern was touching, but it also reinforced the narrative that I was becoming frail and needed special care. Sleeping late occasionally was normal for someone my age, but Michael and Jennifer's response made it seem like evidence of declining health rather than simply a restless night followed by deep sleep. "I was more tired than I realized," I said, accepting the plate of bacon and eggs that Jennifer prepared for me. "That's completely understandable," Michael said, setting aside his papers. "Yesterday was emotionally demanding, talking about finances and future planning. It's normal to feel drained after dealing with so many important decisions." His acknowledgement that our conversation had been emotionally difficult was surprisingly empathetic, and for a moment I felt a flash of the old connection we had shared before everything became complicated by deception and betrayal. This was still my son, still someone who had once depended on me for comfort and guidance, still someone who shared my memories of family traditions and shared experiences. But then I noticed the real estate documents he had been reviewing, and the moment of connection faded into renewed wariness. "What are those papers?" I asked, nodding toward the documents he had been studying. Michael followed my gaze and then looked back at me with an expression of mild surprise,
as if he had forgotten the papers were visible. "Oh, these are just some preliminary information about properties in the area. Market values, recent sales, that kind of thing. I wanted to make sure I understood the local real estate situation in case we need to make any decisions about the house."
"What kind of decisions?"
"Nothing immediate," he said quickly. "But if you do decide to move to a senior community at some point, we'll want to know what the house is worth and how long it might take to sell. It's just good planning to have that information available."
The casualness with which he discussed selling my house was breathtaking.
We were not talking about whether to sell it, but when and how. In Michael's mind, my departure from the house was apparently inevitable, and he was simply preparing for the practical details of liquidating my property. "I haven't agreed to move anywhere," I said, more sharply than I had intended.
"Of course not," Jennifer said soothingly. "We're just gathering information so you can make informed decisions when you're ready."
There's no pressure to do anything quickly. But there was pressure, constant and subtle pressure that came from living with people who believed they knew what was best for me and had the legal authority to implement their decisions regardless of my preferences. Every conversation was designed to lead me toward conclusions they had already reached. Every expression of concern was calculated to make me doubt my own judgment. I excused myself from the breakfast table and walked outside into my garden, hoping that the familiar surroundings would help me think clearly about my increasingly limited options. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. Soon I would need to prepare the garden for cold weather, covering the more delicate plants and cutting back the perennials that would return in spring. If I was still here in spring. Mrs. Henderson waved from her kitchen window, and I walked over to the fence that separated our properties. She was a woman about my age who had lived in the neighborhood almost as long as Robert and I had, and we had shared countless conversations over the years about everything from recipes to grandchildren to the challenges of growing older alone.
"Good morning, Helen. You're out early today."
"Good morning, Dorothy. I was just checking on the garden before the weather changes."
"How are you managing with Michael and Jennifer staying with you? It must be nice to have family close by."
The question was innocent enough, but it reminded me of how my situation appeared to others. From the outside, I looked like a fortunate elderly woman whose caring son had moved in to provide support and companionship. No one could see the legal documents that had stripped away my independence, the forged signatures that had given Michael control over my life, the systematic manipulation that had made me question my own competence and judgment.
"It's an adjustment," I said carefully.
"But they're very helpful."
"I'm sure they are. Michael always seemed like such a responsible young man."
"You're lucky to have raised such caring children."
After a few more minutes of pleasant conversation, I returned to my house feeling even more isolated than before.
The people in my life who might have offered support and assistance saw only what Michael and Jennifer wanted them to see, a devoted son helping his aging mother navigate the challenges of living alone. The truth was invisible to everyone except me, and even I was beginning to doubt my own perceptions under the constant pressure of reasonable explanations and loving concern. The next few days settled into a routine that felt increasingly oppressive despite its surface normalcy. Michael left for work each morning with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose life was proceeding according to plan. Jennifer worked from the living room, her laptop and papers spread across surfaces that had once been my private space. I moved through my own house like a guest who was overstaying her welcome, careful not to disturb their routines or question their decisions. Margaret Chen called Thursday morning with news that managed to be both encouraging and devastating. She had hired a handwriting analyst to examine photocopies of the power of attorney documents, and the preliminary results suggested that my signature had indeed been forged. The analyst identified several inconsistencies that indicate the signature was not written by the same person who signed your recent bank documents, Margaret explained.
"The pressure patterns are different. The letter formations show variations that suggest someone else was attempting to replicate your handwriting."
My heart leaped with hope for the first time in weeks.
"Does this mean we can challenge the power of attorney?"
"It's a good start, but we still face significant obstacles."
"The handwriting analysis would be considered expert testimony in court, but it's not infallible."
"A skilled defense attorney could argue that the variations are due to changes in your physical condition, medication effects, or simply the normal variations that occur in anyone's handwriting over time."
But it proves that someone else signed my name.
It suggests that possibility strongly, but proving it in court and proving that Michael was responsible for the forgery are two different challenges.
We would need additional evidence linking him to the fraudulent documents.
The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Margaret explaining the legal strategies that might be effective and the evidence we would need to build a compelling case. It would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain, but it was the first real hope I had experienced since discovering the extent of Michael's betrayal. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling a mixture of relief and determination that I had not experienced in weeks. The handwriting analysis provided objective proof that my instincts had been correct, that I was not losing my memory or imagining a conspiracy that did not exist. Someone had indeed forged my signature, and while proving Michael's responsibility would require more evidence, at least I now knew that my suspicions were justified. I was still absorbing this news when Jennifer appeared in the kitchen, her expression concerned and slightly puzzled.
Helen, I couldn't help but notice that you've been receiving calls from your attorney quite frequently lately. Is everything all right? Is there something Michael and I should know about? The question felt like a trap, though Jennifer's tone remained gentle and caring.
If I explained about the handwriting analysis and my suspicions about the forged documents, I would be revealing my strategy and giving Michael and Jennifer time to prepare defenses. But if I refused to answer or gave vague responses, I would seem secretive and possibly confused, which could support their narrative about my declining mental capacity. Margaret is helping me understand some legal documents, I said carefully. I wanted to make sure I fully understood what I had signed. That's very wise, Jennifer said, settling onto the chair across from me. Legal documents can be so confusing, especially for people who aren't familiar with all the technical language.
Did she help clarify things for you?
Somewhat.
There are still some questions I need to work through.
Jennifer nodded sympathetically, but I noticed that she seemed to be studying my face carefully, as if she were trying to read my emotions or assess my mental state. The scrutiny made me feel self-conscious and defensive, which probably showed in my expression and made me appear more confused or agitated than I actually was. Helen, Michael and I have been wondering if it might be helpful for you to talk to Dr. Martinez about some of the memory concerns you've been having. Not because we think anything is seriously wrong, but just to get a professional opinion and maybe some suggestions for staying mentally sharp as you get older. The suggestion was presented as caring advice, but I recognized it as another step in the systematic undermining of my credibility. If Dr. Martinez documented any concerns about my memory or cognitive function, those records could be used to support the argument that I had been incompetent when I supposedly signed the power of attorney documents, which would actually strengthen Michael's legal position rather than challenge it.
I don't think that's necessary, I said. My memory is fine. I'm just trying to be careful about understanding important documents.
Of course. And being careful is exactly what we'd expect from someone as responsible as you've always been.
But getting a professional evaluation might actually help prove that your memory is fine. If there are ever any questions about your mental capacity, having recent medical records showing normal cognitive function would be very reassuring. The logic was persuasive, and for a moment I wondered if Jennifer might be right. Medical documentation showing normal mental function could indeed support my case if we ended up in court challenging the power of attorney.
But I also recognized that any medical evaluation would be influenced by Michael and Jennifer's reports about my recent behavior, their descriptions of memory lapses and confusion, their expressions of concern about my ability to live independently. Dr. Martinez would not be evaluating my cognitive function in isolation. She would be assessing me in the context of my family's concerns, and those concerns had been carefully crafted to paint a picture of declining competence and increasing need for supervision. I'll think about it, I said, which seemed to satisfy Jennifer for the moment. That evening, Michael returned from work with news that managed to sound like good fortune but felt like another step toward my complete displacement from my own life.
Mom, I have some exciting news.
There's an opening at Sunrise Manor, that beautiful senior community we looked at last week. It's rare for them to have availability, and they're offering us first consideration if you're interested in touring the facility and possibly putting down a deposit. I had not agreed to put down a deposit anywhere. I had barely agreed to tour facilities, and that agreement had been extracted through gentle persistence rather than genuine enthusiasm on my part.
I thought I was just looking at options, I said. I didn't realize we were ready to make any decisions. We're not making any final decisions, Michael assured me. But Sunrise Manor has a waiting list, and if you ever do decide you want to live there, it could be months before another opening becomes available. Putting down a refundable deposit would just hold your place while you think things through. Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. It really is a lovely place, Helen. And the people we met during our tour seemed so friendly and active. I think you'd enjoy the social aspects of community living. The pressure was subtle but constant, each reasonable suggestion building on the previous ones until resistance seemed unreasonable and agreement seemed inevitable. They were not forcing me to move to an assisted living facility, they were simply helping me prepare for a decision they were confident I would eventually make. The conversation continued through dinner and into the evening, with Michael and Jennifer presenting practical arguments about the benefits of senior community living while I offered increasingly weak objections to their suggestions. By the time we finished discussing the matter, I had agreed to tour Sunrise Manor again and to consider putting down a deposit to secure the available unit. I had not agreed to move there, but I had agreed to take another step in that direction. That night, I called my daughter Sarah in Phoenix, desperately needing to talk to someone who was not part of Michael's systematic campaign to reorganize my life. Sarah was my youngest child, a successful nurse who had moved to Arizona after college and built a life that included a loving husband, 2 teenage daughters, and a career she found fulfilling. Mom! It's so good to hear from you. How are things going with Michael and Jennifer? Are you enjoying having them stay with you? The question was innocent, but it reminded me that Sarah had no idea what was really happening in my life. From her perspective, Michael's decision to move in with me was a generous gesture that provided me with companionship and support while giving him the opportunity to help manage my affairs. It's complicated, I said, not sure how to explain the situation without sounding paranoid or confused. Complicated how? Are you getting on each other's nerves? That's normal when family members live together. It takes time to adjust to sharing space and routines. Sarah, I need to tell you something important, and I need you to listen carefully. Michael has taken over control of my finances and my property using a power of attorney that I never signed. I think he forged my signature on legal documents. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost feel Sarah struggling to process what I had told her. When she finally responded, her voice was careful and concerned. Mom, are you sure about this? That's a very serious accusation. Michael has always been responsible about money, and he loves you. Why would he do something like that? I don't know why. But I know I never signed those papers, and I never agreed to give him power of attorney. I've hired an attorney, and we're investigating the situation. Have you talked to Michael about your concerns? Maybe there's some misunderstanding about what you signed or when you signed it. I tried to talk to him. He says I'm having memory problems, that I'm confused about what happened. But Sarah, I know my own mind. I know I didn't sign those documents. Another long pause, during which I heard one of Sarah's daughters calling for help with homework in the background. The sounds of ordinary family life made my own situation seem even more surreal and frightening. Mom, I'm worried about you. You've been under a lot of stress since Dad died, and managing everything on your own has been difficult. Maybe you should talk to your doctor about these memory concerns. The suggestion that I should seek medical evaluation for memory problems was exactly what Michael and Jennifer had been recommending, and hearing it from Sarah felt like a betrayal. My own daughter was suggesting that my concerns about fraud and forgery were symptoms of mental decline rather than legitimate suspicions about criminal behavior. My memory is fine, I said, more sharply than I intended. I'm not confused or imagining things. I'm telling you that your brother has stolen my house using forged documents. Okay, Mom. I hear you. But I think it would be good for you to get a second opinion about this situation. Maybe talk to Margaret Chen about whether your concerns are justified. If there really is fraud involved, she would be the best person to help you address it. I am working with Margaret. She's the one who told me about the handwriting analysis that proves my signature was forged. Handwriting analysis can be unreliable, Mom. And even if there are problems with some signatures, that doesn't necessarily mean Michael is responsible.
Maybe there was some mistake at the lawyer's office, or maybe you signed the documents at a time when you were stressed or distracted and don't remember clearly. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it became increasingly clear that Sarah was not going to believe my version of events without significant additional evidence. She had known Michael her entire life as a responsible, caring older brother who had always looked out for family interests. The idea that he would deliberately defraud our mother was simply incompatible with her understanding of who he was.
By the time I hung up, I felt more isolated than ever.
My son had betrayed me, my daughter doubted me, and the people who might have offered support saw only what Michael and Jennifer wanted them to see. I was trapped in a situation where the truth was visible only to me, and even I was beginning to question my own perceptions under the constant pressure of reasonable explanations and loving concern.
The following morning brought an unexpected visitor that would change everything.
I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the newspaper when the doorbell rang at 9:15. Michael had already left for work, and Jennifer was upstairs in the shower, so I answered the door myself. A young woman in a professional dark suit stood on my front porch, holding a briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested official business. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with short brown hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses.
Mrs. Patterson? My name is Detective Lisa Morrison with the County Sheriff's Department.
I was hoping I could speak with you about some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your recent legal documents. My heart began pounding so hard I was certain she could hear it. Someone had contacted the police about my situation, though I could not imagine who or how they had learned about the forged power of attorney.
Of course, I said, inviting her inside. Would you like to sit in the living room?
Detective Morrison followed me into the living room and settled onto the couch, opening her briefcase and removing a small notebook and digital recorder. Her manner was professional but kind, with the sort of calm competence that made me feel like someone was finally taking my situation seriously.
Mrs. Patterson, we've received information suggesting that you may have been the victim of financial elder abuse.
Specifically, concerns about power of attorney documents that may not have been executed legally.
I'd like to ask you some questions about your recent legal and financial transactions. The relief I felt was overwhelming.
Someone in authority was finally investigating Michael's actions, finally treating my concerns as legitimate rather than symptoms of mental decline. I had no idea who had contacted the police, but I was profoundly grateful that they were taking elder financial abuse seriously enough to follow up on reports. Yes, I believe my son forged my signature on power of attorney documents. I never signed those papers, and I never agreed to give him control over my finances or property. Detective Morrison made notes while I spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, locations, and specific details about my interactions with Michael and Jennifer. She was thorough but not aggressive, allowing me to tell my story without interruption while documenting everything carefully.
Have you hired an attorney to investigate this matter?
Yes, Margaret Chen. She's arranged for handwriting analysis that shows the signature on the power of attorney was forged.
That's very good, Mrs. Patterson.
Having independent professional analysis strengthens any potential case.
Can you think of anyone who might have witnessed suspicious behavior or conversations that could support your allegations?
I thought for a moment, trying to remember whether anyone else had been present during significant conversations or whether Michael and Jennifer had discussed their plans in front of others. Most of their coordination had been private, conducted in their bedroom or during times when I was not present.
I don't think so. They've been very careful about their conversations around me.
Detective Morrison nodded, as if this response was exactly what she had expected.
That's typical in cases of financial elder abuse.
The perpetrators are usually family members who understand the victim's routines and social connections well enough to avoid detection. We talked for another 30 minutes, with Detective Morrison asking detailed questions about Michael's access to my financial accounts, his knowledge of my legal affairs, and any changes in my living situation that had occurred around the time the power of attorney was executed. She was particularly interested in the timeline of events and whether there had been any pattern of behavior designed to make me question my own competence.
One more question, Mrs. Patterson. Have Michael or Jennifer suggested that you might benefit from medical evaluation for memory problems or cognitive decline?
Yes. They've been suggesting that I talk to my doctor about memory concerns, supposedly to get documentation that my mind is still sharp. But I think they're hoping the doctor will find problems that would support their story about me being confused when I signed the power of attorney.
That would be a very clever strategy, Detective Morrison said grimly.
If they can establish a medical record documenting cognitive concerns, it becomes much harder to challenge their authority or question their decision-making on your behalf. Just then, we heard Jennifer's footsteps on the stairs and the sound of the hairdryer turning off in the upstairs bathroom. Detective Morrison quickly gathered her papers and stood up, handing me a business card with her contact information.
Mrs. Patterson, I want you to continue documenting everything you can remember about this situation.
Keep a journal of conversations, decisions, and any attempts to pressure you into medical evaluations or living arrangement changes. Don't let Michael or Jennifer know about our conversation yet. We need time to investigate before they become aware of police involvement.
What happens now?
I asked, walking her toward the front door. I'll be coordinating with your attorney and following up on several investigative leads. This type of case requires careful documentation and patience, but if Michael has committed financial elder abuse, we will build a case that can stand up in court. Jennifer appeared at the top of the stairs just as Detective Morrison was leaving, and I quickly introduced her as someone from the insurance company following up on a claim. It was not a complete lie, since the sheriff's department did investigate insurance fraud, and Jennifer seemed to accept the explanation without suspicion.
After Detective Morrison left, I felt more hopeful than I had in weeks.
Someone in authority was taking my situation seriously, treating my concerns as legitimate and investigating Michael's actions with professional thoroughness. For the first time since discovering the forged power of attorney, I felt like I might have allies who could help me reclaim control of my life. But I also knew that the investigation would take time, and in the meantime, I was still living with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to manipulate legal systems for their own benefit. If Michael discovered that the police were investigating him, he might accelerate his plans to move me into assisted living or take other actions that would make it even harder for me to challenge his authority. That afternoon, I called Margaret Chen to tell her about Detective Morrison's visit. Margaret was pleased that law enforcement was involved but cautioned me about the challenges we still faced. Police investigation adds credibility to your claims, Helen, but we still need to build a strong enough case to convince a judge to overturn the power of attorney. That means documenting not just the forgery, but also any actions Michael has taken that clearly benefit him rather than you.
What kind of actions?
Any financial transactions that seem motivated by his interests rather than your needs.
Any pressure to make decisions that benefit him. Any attempts to isolate you from family members or friends who might question his authority.
The key is establishing a pattern of behavior that shows he's using the power of attorney for his own advantage. We agreed that I would continue documenting Michael's behavior while Margaret worked with Detective Morrison to build a comprehensive case. It felt good to have a strategy, to be taking action rather than simply enduring whatever Michael and Jennifer decided to impose on my life. When Michael returned from work that evening, I studied his face carefully for any sign that he knew about the police investigation. But he seemed relaxed and cheerful, discussing his day at work and asking about my activities with the same casual interest he had shown for weeks.
How was your day, Mom? Did you do anything interesting?
I spent some time in the garden and caught up on reading. Jennifer mentioned that someone from the insurance company stopped by, but I handled that. Michael nodded absently, more focused on sorting through the mail than on my response. If he had any concerns about insurance investigators or legal questions, he gave no indication of worry or suspicion. Jennifer was equally relaxed during dinner, chatting about her design projects and asking my opinion about color schemes and layout options for a client's logo. The conversation was pleasant and engaging, exactly the kind of family interaction that had made me grateful for their presence in my home during the early weeks of their visit. But now I understood that their warmth and attention were part of a calculated performance designed to make me feel dependent on their care while they systematically dismantled my independence. Every expression of concern was manipulation, every helpful gesture was part of a larger plan to justify their control over my life. After dinner, Michael brought up the subject of my visit to Sunrise Manor, the senior living facility where they had arranged for me to tour a potentially available unit. "Mom, I called Sunrise Manor today, and they're still holding that apartment for you. But they need an answer by Friday about whether you want to put down a deposit. I know you're still thinking things through, but we don't want you to lose this opportunity if you decide senior community living would be a good option." The deadline was new pressure, creating urgency around a decision I had never agreed to make. 2 weeks ago, I had been living independently in my own home with no thoughts of relocating. Now I was being asked to put down a deposit on an apartment I had visited once under duress. "I'm not ready to make that decision," I said firmly. "Of course not. This would just be holding your place while you continue thinking about your options. The deposit is completely refundable if you decide Sunrise Manor isn't right for you." Jennifer nodded supportively. "And having a backup plan might actually make you feel more secure about your long-term housing situation. Even if you never use the apartment, knowing it's available could reduce some of the anxiety about what would happen if living here becomes too difficult." Their reasoning was logical and their tone was caring, but I recognized the manipulation beneath the surface. They were creating artificial urgency around a decision I did not want to make, using reasonable arguments to pressure me into taking steps toward a future I had not chosen. "I need more time to think about this," I said. "Absolutely," Michael agreed. "But maybe we could schedule another visit to Sunrise Manor tomorrow or Thursday, just so you can get a better feel for the place before making any decisions. Sometimes seeing a location multiple times helps clarify whether it would be a good fit." By the end of the conversation, I had agreed to visit Sunrise Manor again on Thursday and to give them an answer about the deposit by Friday evening. I had not agreed to move there, but I had agreed to consider it seriously and quickly. That night, I lay in the guest bedroom making mental lists of everything I needed to document for Detective Morrison and Margaret Chen. Michael's timeline for pressuring me to leave my home was accelerating, probably because he wanted to complete his plan before any questions could be raised about the legitimacy of his power of attorney. If I could delay his plans long enough for the investigation to produce results, I might be able to reclaim control of my life and my property. But if he succeeded in moving me to an assisted living facility before the truth came out, it would be much harder to challenge his actions or return to independent living. I was running out of time.